Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how we see the world in 3 dimensions? And why sometimes our own eyes can play tricks on us? Well, this new research dives deep into the very nature of stereo vision. Imagine looking at 2 circles, one behind the other. Now, what happens if we move them both forward in space? Do they move together like they're glued? Or does one seem to move more than the other? This is the puzzle the Linton stereo illusion tries to solve, and it has gotten scientists thinking. So here's the setup. You have a back circle and a front circle. They're initially a certain distance apart. Now, the researchers move the back circle forward by 10 centimeters. The big question is, how should they move the front circle forward to keep the feeling of separation between them the same? Should they move it the same physical distance? Or should they move it a different distance that is related to how our eyes perceive depth? When people were asked which way the circles looked like they were moving rigidly together, the vast majority chose the option where the perceived separation stayed constant. This is really interesting because it suggests our brain might be prioritizing something other than the simple inches or centimeters between objects. There are 2 main ideas about how we see in 3D. One is that our brain is like a super accurate surveyor measuring distances and shapes in the real world. The other idea proposed by the researcher here is that what you perceive as depth is actually just what your eyes are seeing on your retinas in terms of how the images are offset. In this experiment, when they moved the circles to keep the physical distance the same, people noticed the front circle seemed to stretch out more than the back one, creating a weird concertina effect. But when they adjusted the front circle's movement to keep the retinal disparity the same, the circles seemed to move in depth together much more smoothly and rigidly. This wasn't just a lab experiment. They tested this illusion at scientific meetings. And a whopping 90% of people picked the constant retinal disparity as the one that looked rigid. That is a huge number, showing this effect is really powerful and consistent. Here is a picture from one of those demo nights showing scientists trying out the illusion. You can even try it yourself at home using special glasses, and the researchers have made online demos available. This illusion is so significant because it challenges what we thought we knew about stereo vision. It pushes us to ask, is our 3D perception based on a true 3D map of the world, or is it more about the raw visual information coming into our eyes? The researchers' main idea is that we don't perceive the actual 3D world as accurately as we think. Instead, our perception of depth is directly tied to the disparities or differences between the images seen by your left and right eyes. This suggests that the perceived depth is directly related to how much the images are offset on our retinas. If you double that offset, you essentially double the perceived depth. This is a really core part of the argument. Vergence is when your eyes turn inwards or outwards to focus. Some theories suggest this movement plays a big role in depth perception. However, in this illusion, when the circles moved rigidly, vergence was happening, but it didn't seem to change the perception of depth. This casts doubt on its importance. Depth constancy is this idea that we perceive objects as having the same depth even as we change our viewing distance or the object itself moves. The research suggests this constancy might not be a direct perceptual thing, but more of a mental interpretation of a world that our stereo vision is already distorting. This is a key part of the conflict. Depth constancy theory suggests we don't notice changes in disparity, but the Linton stereo illusion shows that people are very sensitive to these changes, and it is precisely following those changes in disparity that leads to the perception of rigid movement. Now, not everyone agrees with the researchers' interpretation. One alternative idea is that this is all just a known issue called failure of depth constancy. This theory suggests our brains sometimes guess the viewing distance wrong and scale depth perception incorrectly. This idea goes way back with thinkers like Helmholtz, suggesting that if our eyes converge incorrectly, we get illusions about depth. Basically, our brain misinterprets how far away things are. Research like Johnston's in the 1990s showed that at different viewing distances, the same object might look distorted. At close distances, things might look compressed in depth, and at far distances, they might look stretched. This is the basis for the depth constancy argument. The paper argues that while depth constancy might explain some distortions, it predicts the opposite of what is seen in the constant physical separation condition of the Linton illusion, especially at near viewing distances. Instead of compressing, The perceived depth appears to expand as the stimulus moves closer. This movie shows how Johnston's theory predicts one kind of distortion, while Linton's theory predicts another. The key finding is that the actual observation matches Linton's prediction, not Johnston's, for this constant physical separation scenario. Even when considering vergence tracking the stimulus, the depth constancy theory struggles to explain the rigid perception in the constant retinal disparity condition. It predicts some compression, but the experience is much more rigid than the theory allows. Another problem for the depth constancy theory is how it explains what happens when you just shift your gaze between objects. It predicts massive distortions of perceived depth, which simply don't match our everyday experience. Our perception of stereo depth seems quite stable regardless of where we look. A second alternative explanation is that the illusion is just an artifact, a trick of the experiment. Since objects normally get bigger on our retina as they approach, this is called looming or changing angular size, keeping that constant might be confusing our visual system. The researchers made videos where the angular size changes normally. In these cases, the distortions seen in the constant physical separation condition disappear. This suggests that the combination of cues, not just stereo alone, is important in natural viewing. However, the researchers argue that keeping angular size constant is a necessary step to isolate the effect of stereo vision itself. It removes other depth cues so they can focus purely on binocular disparity. They argue that even without the looming cue, the constant retinal disparity condition still feels rigid. If the cue conflict idea were true, this rigid perception shouldn't happen. The fact that it does strongly supports the idea that retinal disparities alone drive this perception of rigidity. This is a crucial point. The illusion works exactly as predicted by the disparity-only theory. For the alternative cue conflict theory to be true, it would need to coincidentally cancel out the effect of disparity in just the right way, which seems unlikely. This section touches on how our brain combines different depth cues. The experiment suggests that while cues like looming might influence our decisions about depth, stereo vision might be the primary driver of the actual perceived depth. The idea here is that things like looming might create a representation of depth, like a picture, but not necessarily change our actual visual experience of depth in the way stereo vision does. Our brain might be fooled into thinking something is moving in depth, but the real perceived depth comes from stereo. Ultimately, the Linton stereo illusion suggests that our perception of depth is not perfectly constant. Our visual system is constantly interpreting a world of changing retinal disparities, and this interpretation is what we experience as 3D. So, what is my take on this research? It is a really fascinating dive into how our brains construct our 3D world. The fact that so many people intuitively pick the constant disparity option is compelling evidence that our perception of depth is heavily influenced, perhaps even dominated by the raw visual information from our two eyes. The failure of depth constancy, an artifact of constant angular size arguments, are important to consider. They highlight that our visual system is complex and integrates many cues. However, the original constant retinal disparity condition, without added cues, still produces that strong sense of rigid motion. This suggests that while other cues help us navigate the real world, the fundamental perception of stereo depth might be more directly tied to retinal disparities than we previously assumed. This research opens up a whole avenue of questions. If perceived depth is so tied to retinal disparities, how does that explain our ability to accurately judge distances in everyday life? How do other cues like texture, perspective, and motion really interact with stereo vision? Future studies could explore this by manipulating different combinations of cues and seeing how they influence the perception of rigidity and depth. It is clear that our visual system is incredibly sophisticated, and illusions like the Linton stereo illusion are invaluable tools for peeling back its layers and understanding the fascinating story of how we see. If you found this as mind-bending as I did, please hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the mysteries of the mind. Thanks for watching.